The first time I unlocked the front door to Mercer Heights as its legal owner, I stood there longer than I needed to. Not because I was nervous, because 9 years earlier, I had slept curled against the brick wall just 10 feet from that same entrance, wearing a thin gray hoodie, a school backpack under my head, and the kind of fear that makes every passing footstep sound like danger. Back then, I was 16, hungry, cold, and trying very hard not to cry where anyone could see me. At 25, I was holding a ring of keys so heavy they dragged against my palm, while a realtor, a property attorney, and the old building manager waited for me to step inside and say something appropriate for a woman making her first major acquisition. But all I could think was this: nobody who saw me here that night would have imagined I'd come back as the owner. Not the tenants who passed me without meeting my eyes. Not the man who told me to move along because I was lowering the tone of the entrance. Not even me. Especially not me. If you've ever had to rebuild a life after the people who should have protected you decided you were disposable, then you already know this story is not really about a building. It's about what happens when survival turns into strategy, and strategy turns into freedom. If this hits somewhere deep, subscribe. Only if it feels true to you. I grew up in Louisville, Kentucky, in a narrow 2-story house with peeling white trim and a front porch. My mother was always promising to repaint. We lived on a street that looked friendlier than it was. Kids rode bikes in the summer. People smiled over fences. Neighbors borrowed sugar and then discussed one another's business in low voices at block parties. From the outside, my family looked ordinary. My father, Rick, managed inventory for a regional auto parts distributor. My mother, Denise, worked reception at a dental office 3 days a week and spent the rest of her energy maintaining the appearance that our family was stable, decent, and basically respectable. I had an older brother named Tyler and a younger sister named Emma. Tyler mattered because he was the son. Emma mattered because she was the baby. I mattered when something needed to be done. That was the shape of it. Not all at once. Not in the dramatic way strangers imagine when they hear a story like mine. Families like mine rarely announce cruelty with fanfare. They build it slowly, through priorities, through tone, through who gets defended, who gets doubted, who gets forgiven, and who gets assigned blame. So often it starts sounding like identity. Tyler was 3 years older than me and had been difficult for as long as I could remember. Though nobody in my house ever used that word. They used softer ones. Strong-willed, misunderstood, restless. A boy who needs direction. He broke things when angry. Skipped school. Borrowed money and forgot about it. Came home smelling like smoke before he was old enough to drive. But my parents treated every mess around him as temporary. A phase. A rough patch. A problem life would solve for him once the world recognized how special he supposedly was. Emma was 6 years younger than me, and born at a time when my mother wanted softness in the house again. By then, Tyler was already a problem nobody could control. And I had already become useful enough to disappear. Emma got tenderness, bedtime stories, matching ribbons, forgiveness before mistakes were even fully explained. I got responsibility. I packed lunches. I remembered parent forms. I folded towels. I made macaroni for Emma when my mother was too tired, and Tyler had stormed off and my father was still at work. By 11, I knew where we kept the extra light bulbs, the rent receipts, and the fake smile my mother wore when company came over. Nobody ever sat me down and said I was less important. They didn't need to. Children know. We always know. We know by how long people let us talk before interrupting, by whose moods matter, by which mistakes become stories the family laughs about and which ones become evidence. I was 12. The first time my father told me I had a chip in my voice. I wasn't rude. I had asked why Tyler was allowed to go to a friend's house after shoving me hard enough into the hallway wall to leave a bruise on my shoulder. My father looked at me across the dinner table and said, "That attitude is exactly why things escalate around you." Escalate around you. That phrase stayed with me. Because even then I knew what he meant. If Tyler exploded, I must have sparked him. If my mother cried, I had probably pushed too far. If the house felt tense, I was somehow the weather. That became my role. The one who caused discomfort by naming what was happening. Tyler dropped out of high school 2 months before graduation. My father called it taking a different path. When I made honor roll that same spring, my mother said, "That's nice. But don't start thinking you're better than everybody." I want to be clear about something. My parents were not monsters in the theatrical sense. They fed us. We had birthdays. There were Christmas mornings with cinnamon rolls and wrapping paper on the carpet. There were school pictures on the wall. There were occasional hugs. Especially when other people were watching. That's part of what makes this kind of abandonment so hard to explain. Because the cruelty lives beside normal things. It hides inside routines. It borrows the language of family while hollowing out the meaning. By 14, I understood 2 truths at once. 1. Nobody in my house was coming to save me from Tyler. 2. My parents needed someone to absorb the pressure he created. That someone was me. If Tyler needed money, mine got borrowed. If Emma needed babysitting, I canceled plans. If my mother was overwhelmed, I cooked. If my father was in a mood, I stayed quiet. There was no medal for this. No gratitude, just expectation. The summer I turned 15, Tyler moved back in after a short-lived attempt to live with a friend. He had a broken phone, a stolen bike, and a new habit of treating every room like it belonged to him. He slept until noon, left dishes everywhere, and spoke to our mother with a contempt so casual it was almost impressive. She still defended him. "He's figuring things out." That was her favorite sentence. As if figuring things out required everybody else to be collateral damage. One humid August evening, I came home from my part-time shift at a grocery store and found Tyler going through my backpack. Not looking for anything specific, just rummaging. My pay envelope was in there. Not much. A little over $100 from a week of after-school hours and Saturday shifts. I told him to stop. He smirked. Said he was just checking whether I had any cash because he needed gas money. He did not have a car. That was not the point. The point was access. He had been given so much permission for so long that other people's boundaries looked optional to him. I reached for my bag. He yanked it back. Something tore. My father came in from the driveway halfway through the argument. I saw Tyler angry and me clutching my bag, and somehow arrived immediately at his usual conclusion. "What did you do now?" I remember the smell of cut grass following him in from outside. I remember my own heartbeat in my ears. I remember understanding, in that split second, that nothing I said would matter. Still, I said it. He was stealing from me. Tyler laughed. My father looked at the torn zipper, then at my face, and said, "If you weren't so dramatic all the time, maybe people wouldn't react to you like this." That was the first time something inside me went cold. Not broken. Cold. Because once you realize fairness is not the operating system, you stop expecting justice from the people in charge. You start planning. Quietly. I began hiding money in a geometry textbook under my bed because no one in my family had ever voluntarily opened a math book. I took extra shifts at the grocery store. I started keeping a small notebook with numbers in it. Wages. Busroute. Safe houses. A guidance counselor's office hours. The address of a youth shelter downtown I had seen on a flyer by the library. I was 15. I was not planning to run away. I was planning for reality. There's a difference. The year everything snapped. Tyler was 19, and somehow meaner than before. Not wilder, not more reckless in the visible sense. Meaner, the kind of meanness that comes from a person who has failed too many times to maintain the illusion of superiority and needs someone nearby to stand on. That someone was still me. By then I had a boyfriend named Caleb. Not serious in the adult sense. We were 16. He worked weekends at his uncle's hardware store, played rhythm guitar badly, and smelled faintly like sawdust and laundry detergent. But he was gentle, consistent, the kind of boy who listened all the way through your sentence. My parents did not like him, officially because I was too young to get distracted. Unofficially because Caleb came from the kind of family that made our dysfunction look louder. His mother asked follow-up questions. His father said thank you for dinner when he visited. They noticed things. My mother hated being noticed. Caleb became another source of tension in the house. Not because he did anything wrong, because he represented the possibility that I might build attachment somewhere else. And people who benefit from your loyalty rarely like competition. One Friday in late October. After a cold rain had turned the whole city, metallic and gray, I came home and found my mother sitting at the kitchen table with my backpack in front of her. Open. My stomach dropped instantly. Parents who respect you don't go through your things in secret and then wait in silence for the performance of control. My father was standing by the sink. Tyler leaned against the doorway with that look on his face. Interested. Almost cheerful. "What is this?" my mother asked. In front of her was my notebook. The one with bus routes. Shelter addresses. Hours. And cash totals. For a moment I couldn't speak, because I understood the danger immediately. Not what the notebook was. What they needed it to mean. "It's mine," I said carefully. My father's jaw tightened. "We know it's yours." "Mara. That's me. By the way, Mara Collins." I haven't said my name yet because for a long time it felt like a thing other people used when they wanted something from me. But that night, hearing it in my father's mouth, clipped and annoyed, reminded me how names can sound like accusations when spoken by the wrong person. My mother tapped the notebook with one painted fingernail. "Why do you have shelter addresses?" I looked at Tyler. He smiled. Very slightly. That was enough. He knew. Maybe not every detail, but enough to know I had prepared for the possibility that life with my family might one day become impossible. And instead of feeling shame, I remember feeling fury, not because they found the notebook. Because the only reason a 16-year-old girl keeps addresses for youth shelters is that home has already stopped feeling safe. Because I wanted to know what my options were. I said. My father straightened. "What is that supposed to mean?" My voice shook. But I kept going. "It means Tyler steals from me. It means nobody does anything. It means I can't leave my things in my room. It means every time he gets angry, somehow it's my fault." Tyler pushed off the doorway. "Oh! May God. Here we go." My mother's face hardened in the way it did when she decided the real issue was not the thing happening, but the fact that I had named it out loud. "You are not a victim," she snapped. I looked at her. "No. I'm the person you blame, so you don't have to deal with him." That was it. That was the sentence. The one no one in my family had allowed me to say for years. The one hanging in the kitchen air between a bowl of old apples, a pile of unpaid utility bills, and the fluorescent hum of the overhead light. My father moved first. Not toward Tyler. Toward me. He slammed his hand flat on the table, so hard the notebook jumped. "You will not speak to your mother that way?" I did not back up. That surprised all of us. "Then stop making me live this way." Tyler laughed. Actually laughed. And my father turned to me with a look I will never forget because it was not anger anymore. It was relief. The relief of finally having a clean target. "Maybe if you're so miserable here," he said, "you should go." Silence. Even Tyler blinked. My mother's face changed for half a second. But only half. Not enough to stop him. Just enough to show that she knew he had crossed into something serious. I waited. Because sometimes adults hear themselves once the room goes quiet. He didn't take it back. Instead, he said, "Louder now. You think you're so grown? Fine. Go be grown." I looked at my mother. She could have ended it right there. One sentence. "Rick." "Stop." She said nothing. That was the moment my family abandoned me. Not when my father told me to leave. When my mother decided his cruelty was more convenient than my pain. I said, "Are you serious?" My father folded his arms. "If this house is so unbearable, no one's forcing you to stay. There are sentences that divide a life into before and after. That was one of mine." I went upstairs shaking so hard I could barely get my duffel bag open. I packed jeans, socks, 2 hoodies, my school binder, my toothbrush, a framed photo of me and Emma at the zoo from when she was little, and the money from inside the geometry book, $236. Everything I had. Emma was asleep. I stood outside her room for a full minute with my hand on the doorframe, listening to the tiny, soft breaths of a child who had no idea the family geography was changing around her. I didn't wake her. I didn't want her last memory of that night to be my face. Caleb picked up on the second ring. I said, "Can you come get me?" He didn't ask why. Just said, "I'm leaving now." That kind of steadiness can save a life. He parked half a block away because he knew enough not to start a public war in front of my house. His truck heater smelled dusty and warm. I climbed in with my duffel in my lap, looked back once at the porch light, still glowing over the front steps, and waited for my father to come outside. He didn't. Neither did my mother. No one ran after me. No one called before we reached the end of the street. That is the thing people never understand when they romanticize survival. The worst part is not the hunger. Not at first. It is the silence. The absolute silence from the people who were supposed to love you automatically. Caleb's parents let me stay for 3 nights. 3. That wasn't cruelty. That was caution. They had a small house, 2 younger sons, and enough common sense to know taking in a minor without legal arrangements could become a problem fast. His mother made me grilled cheese and tomato soup and cried in the kitchen where she thought I couldn't hear. His father called the school counselor Monday morning and asked who they needed to talk to. My parents did not call. Not on day 1. Not on day 2. Not on day 3. That was the second abandonment. Not the explosion. The confirmation. By the 4th day, I was sitting in the office of my school counselor, Ms. Lita. While she spoke in the careful, calm voice adults use when they are trying to contain their own anger, she called my mother from the office speaker so everyone would stay accountable to facts. My mother answered. Her tone was tired, annoyed, as if we were discussing paperwork she had forgotten to sign. "Ms. Ritter said I needed stable housing." My mother said, "She chose to leave." I can still feel the cold that went through me at those words. Chose. As if a 16-year-old girl gathering clothes into a duffel after being told to go was making an empowered lifestyle decision. "Ms. Ritter asked whether I could come home if there were mediation. My mother paused, then said, "Not while she's this hostile." Hostile. That was the label she selected. Not scared, not displaced, not 16. Hostile. My father didn't get on the phone. He didn't need to. He had already done the essential part, made me removable. Ms. Ritter arranged for me to be placed temporarily through a youth crisis program downtown. The building was clean but tired. Beige cinder block walls. Industrial soap smell. Vending machine hum. A staff woman named Carla gave me a toothbrush still in the wrapper. 2 clean towels. And a binder full of rules. No curfew violations. No guests. No missing check-ins. Attend school. Attend counseling. Keep trying. Keep trying. That became my whole religion for a while. I stayed there 6 weeks. During the day, I went to school pretending my life had not split open. At night, I slept in a narrow bed under a rough blanket and learned the strange intimacy of institutional spaces. Girls crying quietly after lights out. Doors opening and closing. Someone laughing too loudly down the hall because pain often comes disguised as attitude in places like that. I did not tell many people. Shame loves secrecy. And homelessness comes wrapped in shame even when it isn't your fault. At school, I said I was staying with family friends. Caleb knew the truth. Ms. Ritter knew the truth. My English teacher suspected enough not to press, but she started leaving granola bars in the top drawer of her desk and forgetting to notice when I took one on my way out. Little kindnesses can feel humiliating when you need them. They can also keep you alive. Around Thanksgiving, the crisis placement reached its limit, and the next option was a transitional host arrangement through a nonprofit network. Rotating beds, different homes, temporary stays. The word temporary sounds manageable until it becomes the architecture of your life. 1 week with an older widow who insisted on praying over me every night like I was a niece she had misplaced. 10 days with a church couple who were polite but watched their wallets too carefully. 12 days with a nurse and her teenage son who never asked intrusive questions and therefore felt like luxury. Then gaps. Always gaps. Times when nothing lined up. Times when the beds were full or the forms were delayed, or adults who meant well remembered they had limits. That is how I ended up outside Mercer Heights the first time. It wasn't the only place I slept rough that winter. Just the one that stayed with me. The bus had stopped running for the night. I had a duffel bag. $39. A dead phone. And nowhere I could get to before morning. Mercer Heights had a recessed brick entrance with a little overhang and a side wall that cut some of the wind. It was downtown enough to feel visible and anonymous at the same time. People were around until late. That mattered. Predators like privacy. I sat there hugging my knees until around 1 in the morning. Then lay down because exhaustion eventually outranks fear. The concrete bled cold through my jeans. My backpack straps dug into my shoulder. Somewhere nearby, a bottle shattered. A couple argued in slurred voices half a block away. A man in a wool coat stepped over my feet without apology. I remember the smell most clearly. Wet cement. Old cigarette smoke. City exhaust. And the sharp mineral smell of winter closing in. At some point, just before dawn, the building manager opened the front door and found me there. He was bald, broad-shouldered, and already irritated by the existence of other people before sunrise. "You can't sleep here," he said. I sat up too fast, dizzy and ashamed. "I'm sorry. I'm leaving." He looked at my school backpack. My face. My duffel. He knew exactly what I was. He just didn't want me attached to his building. "You girls are always sorry," he muttered. "Move along before tenants start complaining." "You girls." As if there were enough of us for him to have a category. I stood up, every joint stiff, and walked to the bus stop half a block away, with tears burning behind my eyes, so hard I thought I might throw up. Not because he was cruel, because he was casual. Casual cruelty leaves deeper marks than rage. Rage at least acknowledges your existence. Casual cruelty means your pain is administrative. That morning I went to school in the same clothes I had slept in and got a 93 on a chemistry exam. Nobody knew. That's the strange thing about collapse. Sometimes it happens invisibly. You can be freezing at dawn and still raising your hand in third period because the assignment is due, and the world keeps rewarding performance long after it has withdrawn mercy. December was the worst month. Cold enough that your teeth hurt when you breathe too fast. Holiday lights and shop windows making every street corner feel like a joke. Families carrying shopping bags while I figured out whether I could stretch a cheap sandwich over 2 meals. My parents sent exactly one message that month. Not to ask where I was. Not to ask whether I had a coat. Just one text from my mother on December 23rd. Emma misses you. I hope you've learned something from all this. I stared at that message until the screen dimmed. Then I put the phone face down on the table in the library and understood, more clearly than I ever had, that I was on my own. That knowledge was devastating. It was also clarifying. When no rescue is coming, fantasy becomes expensive. You stop waiting. You start building. By January, I had a system. School first, work second, survival in between. I increased my shifts at the grocery store and picked up weekend cleaning hours through one of the nonprofit coordinators. Early mornings in office buildings that smelled like copier toner and stale coffee, empty trash cans, wiped fingerprints off glass, vacuum lines on carpet. No one important would ever notice. I opened a checking account with help from Carla. I applied for every scholarship my guidance office could find. I kept my grades high enough that teachers looked at me with approval instead of concern. And for a while, that approval became its own kind of shelter. Then, around February, I met the woman who changed the direction of my life. Her name was Mrs. Alvarez, and she taught accounting at the community college. I did not meet her as a student. I met her because I was cleaning the administrative offices before dawn one Saturday, and she came in early carrying 2 canvas totes and humming softly under her breath. She was in her late 50s then. Silver streak in her dark hair. Sharp eyes. No wasted language. She saw me wiping down a conference room table and said, "You're too young to be here." I almost lied. Instead, I said, "Probably." She set down her bags, looked at me for a long second, then asked, "Are you smart?" It was such a strange question, I nearly laughed. "I think so." "What do you get in math?" "Us." "Good. Don't apologize when you answer." That was the first thing she gave me. Not food. Not pity. Posture. Over the next few weeks, she learned enough of my situation to understand that I was not looking for rescue so much as traction. She began leaving practical things where I could take them without ceremony. Protein base, a transit pass, an old graphing calculator. She asked about my classes, about graduation plans, about whether anyone had explained compound interest to me properly. No one had. So she did. Not in a sentimental way. In a fierce one. She taught me about money like it was a language powerful people hoped girls in unstable homes would never become fluent in. Budgeting. Credit. Assets. Leverage that was real. Not theatrical. How property ownership works. How bad decisions compound. How good ones do too. The first time she said, "Never confuse income with security." I wrote it down on the back of a receipt and kept it in my wallet for years. She did not offer to take me in. I respect her for that. She offered something better. A future that could be engineered. And for the first time since I left home, I began to see one. By spring, I was living in a way that would have looked impossible from the outside and completely ordinary from the inside. That is what survival does to you. It normalizes things. No child should have to normalize. I woke before dawn twice a week to clean offices. I went to school. I worked the grocery store. I rotated through temporary housing when placements were available. And in every gap between those things, I tried to become someone the future might actually have room for. Mrs. Alvarez became the first adult in my life who treated my mind like an asset instead of a problem. Not a miracle, not a tragedy. An asset? That distinction matters. Pity makes you smaller. Respect gives you shape. She started leaving me practice problems in a manila folder at the front desk of the administrative building. Balance sheet basics, interest scenarios, budget exercises, real estate case studies simplified enough for a teenager with too little sleep but not dumbed down. She told me to bring them back completed if I wanted her help. So I did. Every page. Every week. 11. After I had worked through 3 different financing examples and scribbled notes in the margins about risk. She looked over my answers and said, "You do not think emotionally when numbers are involved." I thought she was criticizing me. She saw my face and shook her head. That is a gift, especially for someone raised in chaos. Nobody had ever called anything about me a gift before unless it was a euphemism for tolerance. That sentence stayed with me, because she was right. I had spent so many years in a house where reality changed depending on who was telling the story that numbers felt almost holy. Cold. Vérifiable. Unimpressed by charm. I loved that. Numbers did not care who your parents liked more. They did not rearrange themselves because someone had a loud personality or an excuse polished enough to sound like insight. Reality could be brutal, but it was at least consistent. By the end of my senior year, Ms. Ritter and Mrs. Alvarez had quietly built a bridge under me, without ever making me feel like I was being carried. Ms. Ritter helped me secure emergency education support and pushed my scholarship applications through with a persistence that bordered on holy. Mrs. Alvarez connected me to an accelerated bookkeeping certificate at the community college and a summer clerical job with a small property management office she knew through a former student. Property management. At the time, it sounded dull. Administrative. A thing adults in beige slacks did while holding clipboards. I had no idea it was going to become the backbone of my life. I graduated high school with honors in a borrowed dress and shoes a shelter coordinator's sister had donated after a wedding. My parents did not come. Emma didn't either. I had sent a message to my mother with the time and location, just in case there was some buried part of her that still understood what milestones meant. There was no reply. When my name was called, I crossed the stage to applause from teachers, staff, Caleb, his parents, Ms. Rita, Charla, and Mrs. Alvarez. It wasn't a huge crowd. It wasn't cinematic, but it was real. And when I stepped back down holding that diploma cover in both hands, I realized something that made my chest ache. Sometimes family is not the first people assigned to you. Sometimes it is the people who show up once you've become inconvenient to the rest. Caleb and I lasted another 8 months after graduation. Long enough to prove that affection is not always enough to carry 2 very different futures in the same direction. He was kind to the end. I want that on record. He never weaponized my instability. Never made me feel dirty for what I had survived. Never used my dependence against me while I had any. But by then my life was built around motion. Work, night classes, temporary rooms. Saving every dollar I could keep. Caleb wanted roots earlier than I could afford to imagine them. He wanted certainty, Sunday lunches, predictability, A version of life that sounded beautiful and impossible at the same time. We ended on a bench in a small park near the river, while late summer heat sat heavy over everything. He said, "You're always halfway to somewhere else." He wasn't accusing me, just noticing. I looked at the water and said, "That's because I've never been somewhere safe enough to stop." He cried before I did. That was the end of my first love. Gentle, sad, necessary. The kind of ending that teaches you not all loss is betrayal. At 18, I rented a room in a narrow old duplex owned by a widow named Mrs. Wedo. Carlin, who believed in cash envelopes, hard candy, and not asking questions, unless someone volunteered answers. My room had slanted ceilings, one stiff window, and wallpaper with tiny blue flowers fading into yellow. It was the first space I had ever occupied that was mine by agreement instead of mercy. I paid rent on time. That mattered to me almost more than the room itself. Rent meant legitimacy. Address meant paperwork. Paperwork meant existence. I worked days at Hawthorne Residential. The property management company, Mrs. Alvarez, had connected me to and took bookkeeping and business courses at night. Hawthorne managed mid-range apartment buildings, duplex, and a few aging mixed-use properties around Louisville. Nothing glamorous. But if you want to understand a city, work in housing, you learn where people break, where they recover, which buildings are being held together by paint and denial, and which owners understand that maintenance is not charity. It's math. My first job there was entry-level administrative support. Phones, rent ledgers, vendor scheduling, lease packets, move-in checklists. I loved it immediately. Not the work itself. At first, what the work revealed, every building was a system. Every system had weak points. Late payments told stories. Repair delays told stories. Turnover rates told stories. So did who listened to tenants and who treated them like inconvenient line items. I learned how to read a property the way some people read weather. A broken intercom is never just a broken intercom. It's a signal. Peeling stair rail paint isn't cosmetic if liability claims are waiting beneath it. A manager who calls every tenant complaint an overreaction is usually covering incompetence. A landlord who keeps units half vacant because he refuses to modernize isn't traditional. He's bleeding money in slow motion. I was good at this. Very good. Not because I had some glamorous instinct. Because when you grow up in a dangerous emotional environment, you become excellent at pattern detection. Housing just gave those instincts a more profitable application. By 19, I was handling delinquency tracking and vendor reconciliation. By 20, I had moved into junior operations support and started sitting in on acquisition reviews. Most people my age were still figuring out majors. I was learning how plumbing, tenant retention, utility efficiencies, renovation budgets, and debt service ratios all talk to one another. Mrs. Alvarez kept tutoring me on the side. Harder now. She drilled me on cash flow and warned me never to romanticize real estate just because people who had never cleaned a hallway liked to call it passive income. There is no passive anything in buildings, she said once while tapping a stack of expense reports. Only people who don't notice labor because somebody else is carrying it. That sentence felt like truth at every level of my life. Around that time, my mother finally called. Not because she missed me, because Tyler needed something. I recognized her number immediately and almost let it ring out. Instead, I answered in the parking lot outside Hawthorne, the late afternoon heat making the air shimmer above the asphalt. Her voice was tentative in a way I had never heard before. Mara, I closed my eyes. Hey. Mom. No apology. No, how are you? Just a pause. Then? Your brother is going through a rough time. Of course he was. Tyler was always going through a rough time. In our family? That phrase covered everything from unemployment to theft, to shattered relationships, to avoidable consequences nobody wanted to name directly. I said nothing. She continued. He's trying to get back on his feet. Your father thought maybe... Since you're working now. As if my job had materialized from nowhere. As if the years between 16 and 19 had been a decorative transition instead of a war. You want money? I said. She inhaled sharply. Offended by precision. Well, not exactly. Just a little help. Temporary. I leaned against my car and stared across the lot at a row of faded crepe myrtles. Did you call to ask where I've been living? Silence. Did you call to ask whether I was safe all those months? More silence? Then, brittle and familiar. You always make everything so difficult. There it was. My old role. The problem not because I suffered, but because I insisted on language that matched reality. I said, I'm not giving Tyler money. Her tone hardened. He's your brother. And I was your daughter when I was 16. She hung up. My hands shook afterward. Not because I regretted it, because some wounds remain raw even after you've built skin over them. The body remembers what the mind tries to organize. That night I went to Mrs. Alvarez's apartment for dinner. It was a small, second-floor place filled with books. Basile Plan. And framed black and white photographs of people I assumed she loved enough to keep visible. She served arroz con pollo and listened without interrupting while I told her about the phone call. When I finished, she folded her napkin and said, You think saying no makes you cruel because cruel people trained you to feel guilty for refusing to be useful. I stared at her, then laughed once. Though my eyes were burning. That sounds accurate. It is accurate. She poured more water into my glass. Mara. Boundaries are not punishments. They are infrastructure. Infrastructure. Of course she would use that word. And of course it would make perfect sense to me. You cannot build a stable life on open access. So I didn't. Over the next few years, my world got bigger, in all the quiet ways that matter most. I completed my associate degree, then transferred into a bachelor's program part-time with tuition assistance from Hawthorne because, by then, the company had figured out I was more useful than my job title suggested. I was promoted twice. First to assistant property analyst, then to operations coordinator. I moved out of the blue flower room and into a clean studio with scratched hardwood floors. One good window, and a radiator that hissed like an old man clearing his throat every winter morning. I bought my first decent winter coat, my first laptop that wasn't secondhand, my first mattress new from a store. These things may sound small if you've never gone without them. They are not small. Safety often arrives disguised as ordinary objects you no longer have to borrow. At 21, I began saving seriously. Not vaguely. Seriously. High-yield savings. Automatic transfers. Emergency fund first. Then investment basics. Then a separate account labeled property in all caps. Mrs. Alvarez liked that. Specific money behaves better, she said. By then I understood enough about housing to know I did not just want a job in real estate. I wanted ownership. Not because ownership is glamorous, because ownership changes the direction of force. I was tired of spending my whole life inside systems built by other people's priorities. I wanted leverage that was honest. Tyler, meanwhile, became the family's revolving emergency. Die. Short-term jobs. A girlfriend he moved in with too fast and lost too predictably. Repair bills. Bad luck. Wrong crowd. Stress. The explanations changed. The structure did not. My parents kept rescuing him in pieces they could afford, and some they could not. My father refinanced the house once. My mother started taking extra shifts. Emma grew into a cautious teenager who learned to move quietly when Tyler was around. The same way I once had. Sometimes she would message me. Careful little updates. School pictures? A debate team ribbon. Ons? Just, I miss you. Those messages could split me open for hours. I wanted to take her out of that house. I couldn't. Not yet. So I did the only thing I knew how to do. I stayed steady enough that one day I might actually have something solid to offer. At 22, Hawthorne put me on a due diligence team reviewing the sale of a distressed mixed-use property downtown. I spent 3 weeks buried in maintenance records. Tenant history. Utility inefficiencies. Code violation. And financial projections. While the senior people debated market trends and cosmetic upgrades, I flagged 3 operational failures that would have turned the investment into a slow bleed over 18 months. They listened. Not politely. Seriously. The acquisition director, a blunt man named Leonard Gaines, who respected competence more than charm, called me into his office afterward and said, "You see what most people decorate around? That was maybe the most valuable compliment of my career." A year later, he promoted me to asset management support and started taking me to meetings well above my formal rank. I learned how investors think, how banks hesitate, how city inspectors can become either enemies or allies, depending on whether you're lying to them, and how ownership without reserves is just a prettier way to fail. I also learned something else. Distressed property often carries invisible human history. Evictions, deaths, domestic calls, hoarding, elderly tenants forgotten by family, young men pretending confidence can cover non-payment, single mothers doing math at kitchen tables while pretending the kids don't notice. A building is never just a building. It is an archive of who was protected and who was left to improvise. That mattered to me more than I said out loud. At 23, I bought my first property interest. Not a building. A stake. Tiny. By experienced investor standards. Massive. By mine. A 5% share in a 6-unit rental owned through a partnership Leonard assembled for employees willing to invest. The numbers were modest. The cash flow wasn't life-changing. But when the first quarterly distribution hit my account, I sat on my couch, staring at the deposit notice for a full minute. Not because of the amount, because ownership had stopped being theoretical. I called Mrs. Alvarez. She answered on the 3rd ring and said, "Tell me something good." So I did. She let me finish. Then said, "Good. Now don't get sentimental. Reinvest." I laughed harder than I had in weeks. That was her love language. Stand up. Keep moving. Don't mistake one good moment for the end of the work. I didn't. By 24, I had outgrown Hawthorne in the way good employees sometimes do when they become too useful to keep in the same room forever. Leonard saw it before I did. He told me I could stay and probably rise comfortably. Or I could take a bigger role at a development firm in Cincinnati he had a relationship with. "Your instincts are too sharp for middle management," he said. That sentence changed my life. I took the interview, then the job, then a tiny 1-bedroom apartment in Cincinnati with radiators, a narrow galley kitchen, and enough room for a table if you didn't mind not opening a drawer all the way. It felt like possibility. The new company, Vale Ridge Development, specialized in revitalizing neglected urban properties, not luxury towers, not glossy vanity projects for men who liked drone footage. Functional buildings, older stock, mixed-income housing, underperforming properties, everyone else mispriced because they misunderstood what was broken and what was merely unfashionable. I thrived there. The pace was brutal. The expectations high. The politics real. But the work fit me. By then, I had become the kind of woman who could walk through a building once and tell you whether management failure, capital starvation, or tenant fatigue was the dominant problem. I could see where money would matter, where discipline would matter more, and where the storytellers in a room were lying to themselves about timelines. That skill made me valuable. Value, when correctly recognized, changes your life. I was 24 when I saw Mercer Heights on a watch list for the first time. I almost missed the name. It was buried inside a packet of aging multifamily assets being quietly marketed off-book after a long-term owner's health decline and some ugly deferred maintenance problems. Average occupancy, slipping collections, outdated systems, underleveraged location, strong upside if someone disciplined took over. Mercer Heights. The name made something in my body go still. I waited until I was alone before pulling up the address. Same brick facade, same recessed entrance, Sama overhung, same slice of sidewalk where I had once spent a night trying not to disappear. For a minute. I just stared at the screen. Not because I believed in signs. I don't. I believe in timing, pattern, and preparation. But sometimes life places a fact in front of you with such force it feels personal anyway. I did not announce my history to anyone. I did not turn it into some dramatic confession in a conference room. I built a case. That is what I do. Mercer Heights was exactly the kind of property Vale Ridge could acquire if approached carefully. The owner's estate wanted a discreet sale. The building was underperforming, mostly because the management was lazy. Maintenance was reactive instead of preventive. And the leasing strategy treated people like temporary inconveniences instead of long-term revenue. The bones were strong. The location better than the rent roll reflected. The common areas tired but fixable. Operational inefficiencies everywhere. It was not a pity purchase. That mattered to me. I would not buy my past as a monument. I would buy a viable building because I understood its value better than the people neglecting it. The first presentation I made internally was clinical. Collections trend, expense ratios, turnover data, capital needs, projected lift under structured management. I did not mention the winter I was 16. I didn't need to. The math was enough. Vale Ridge agreed to pursue it. But the deal structure shifted midway through due to capital allocation changes and a partner dispute on another project. Suddenly, Mercer Heights was no longer a clean institutional buy. It needed a hybrid structure. More sponsor risk, more personal stake. That should have ended my involvement. Instead, it opened a door. Leonard, who was now semi-retired, but still advising two firms informally, reviewed the numbers with me over lunch and said, "You know this asset better than anyone. If you want a shot, this is your shot." I thought he meant leading it. He shook his head. "I mean buying in." I laughed at first, then realized he was serious. I had savings, investment history, a clean record, credibility. Not enough to buy Mercer Heights alone, but enough to anchor a smaller acquisition group if I was willing to put nearly everything I had built at risk. That night I sat at my kitchen table with spreadsheets open until after midnight. My tea went cold twice. The radiator clicked in the corner. Outside, someone in the building next door played saxophone badly through an open window. And for some reason that made the whole moment feel unbearably alive. Fear is easiest to hear late at night. It listed everything that could go wrong: the debt load, the renovations, the vacancy exposure, the possibility of over-identifying with the building and making a stupid emotional choice. All valid. Then another voice answered. Not irrational confidence. Something better. Evidence. I knew this asset. I knew the market. I knew operations. I knew pain points most investors ignored because they had never actually had to stand outside a locked building and calculate what safety costs after midnight. By morning, I had my answer. I wasn't chasing symbolism. I was making a disciplined move on an asset I understood unusually well. That distinction saved me. The deal took 5 months. 5 exhausting, unforgiving, paperwork-heavy months. There were appraisals, lender calls, inspection, repair estimates, insurance reviews, legal revisions, reserve requirements, occupancy questions, title cleanup, and one miserable week where I thought the financing would collapse over a dispute about exterior masonry obligations and an old code citation no one had cleared properly. I lost sleep. I lived on protein bars and coffee. I learned that stress in acquisition has a smell. Printer heat. Stale conference rooms. Your own adrenaline turning metallic at the back of your throat. My father called once during that period. Out of nowhere. He had gotten my number from Emma after I changed it years earlier and only shared it selectively. He sounded older, rougher around the edges. Mada, he said. Like the name itself had weight now. I said hello. He asked how work was. We performed politeness for a while. Then he said Tyler was staying with them again. Again. I closed my eyes. My father kept talking. Maybe because silence had started to make him nervous with me. He's had a bad run. I almost smiled. Those words had aged like mold in my family. Always a bad run. Never a pattern. Never character. Never the cost of endless rescue. Then my father did something he had never done before. He asked, quietly, "Are you doing okay?" Not because he needed something first. Not as preamble. As a question. I looked at the lender package spread across my table. I thought about the building. About 16. About cold concrete. About all the years between. And I said, yes, I am. It was the truth. The cleanest revenge in the world is being able to answer that honestly after people once bet against your survival. Closing day arrived on a windy Thursday in early May. The sky was bright enough to feel almost rude. My blazer was navy. My hands were steady. The attorney passed documents across polished wood. Names were signed. Funds moved. Obligations became legal. Risk became real. Then it was done. Mercer Heights was ours. Mine. In the way ownership actually works. Structured, leveraged, partnered, responsible, not fantasy, reality. When I drove there afterward with the keys in my bag, I parked across the street first, just sat there, watching tenants come and go, watching the entrance, remembering the way the brick had felt cold against my shoulder 9 years earlier. The building manager waiting for me that day was not the same man who had thrown indifference at me when I was 16. He had retired. This was a younger replacement named Colin. Eager and slightly nervous. Trying too hard to sound seasoned, the old manager was still around. Though, living on-site in a reduced arrangement due to age and health. That fact landed oddly when I learned it. Not because I wanted revenge, because life has a sense of structure sharper than irony. The first week as owner was all work, occupancy reviews, vendor renegotiation, security upgrades, lighting schedule changes, delinquency planning, resident communications, deferred maintenance triage. Real ownership leaves very little room for poetic lingering. That helped. It kept the emotions from driving. Then, on the 8th day, I saw him, the old manager. He was shuffling slowly across the lobby in a beige jacket, carrying a pharmacy bag and muttering at the mailboxes. Older now, stooped, smeller, but unmistakable. When he looked up, there was no recognition in his eyes. Why would there be? To him, I had been one of many inconvenient girls attached to one difficult morning. I should have felt triumphant. I didn't. I felt calm. That surprised me most. Because when you have imagined closure for years, you assume it will burn hotter. But closure often arrives cool. He frowned at the clipboard in my hand. Are you with management? I looked at him. Yes. He nodded once. As long as they finally fixed the front lights. Been saying that for months. I almost laughed. The front lights. The same entrance where I had once spent a night half hidden because dimness felt safer than exposure. We're fixing them, I said. And we did. That week, better lighting, camera upgrades, entry protocol changes, a cold weather outreach contact list for overnight shelter referrals posted discreetly near the inside vestibule, because I knew exactly what the city feels like when the buses stop and you have nowhere left to negotiate with. That was the difference between ownership and fantasy. Ownership lets you change policy, not just posture. The public peak came 2 months later, not in a ballroom, not at a family dinner. At Mercer Heights itself, my company hosted a small community open house after the first phase of improvements. Nothing lavish. Coffee, local bakery trays, updated leasing materials, a short presentation about security enhancements, tenant communication standards, and the renovation timeline, city contacts, nearby business owners, residents, a few investor-adjacent people. It was partly marketing, partly transparency, partly a way to signal that the building was under serious stewardship now. Emma Kame. She was 19 by then, studying early childhood education at a commuter college and living mostly on campus to stay out of the house. We had rebuilt carefully over the years through messages, coffee dates, and one long tearful walk along the river where she admitted she thought I had abandoned her too, until she got old enough to understand adults can lie about who left whom. I told her the truth. She cried. So did I. After that, she became mine again in the quiet, sisterly way that matters. She brought my mother to the open house. I hadn't invited her directly, not because I was punishing her, because I had stopped designing my life around what she might do inside it. My father came too. So did Tyler. That last part, I only learned when I saw him. He looked older than his years, bloated in the face, tired around the mouth, a man who had spent too long expecting life to keep resetting after each disaster. He stood near the refreshments table with his hands in his pockets, glancing around the lobby as if trying to decide whether being there made him proud, threatened, or embarrassed. Maybe all three. My mother cried during my presentation, quietly. My father did not. He just watched me with the fixed attention of a man finally understanding that the daughter he once treated as structurally secondary had built something he could not explain away. When I finished, people clapped. Then a local housing liaison stepped up and thanked me publicly for integrating youth outreach contacts into the building's overnight safety protocol. She said it was rare to see owners think that specifically about vulnerable people near a property. She called it compassionate and practical. Compassionate and practical. The exact combination my family had always misread as hardness. That was when Tyler chose to speak. Of course he did. A small knot of people had formed around us by then, Tenant, staff, guests. My mother standing just behind Emma, my father off to the side, Tyler holding a paper cup too tightly. He gave a short laugh and said, "Loud enough to carry. Guess all that drama was good for something." The lobby went quiet. Not fully, but enough. Some people looked confused. Some looked uncomfortable. Emma went rigid beside my mother. Tyler kept going because men like him often mistake silence for permission. "Mara was always dramatic," he said, "even when we were kids. You'd think she came from some war zone. Not a normal house." There are moments when the past presents itself in living form and asks whether you are still available to participate in your own diminishment. I looked at him. Then I looked around that lobby. At the repaired lights. At the polished floor. At the tenants talking to staff without fear. At the building that once treated me like a problem on the sidewalk and now sat inside my portfolio because I had learned how power actually works. Then I answered, calmly, "That normal house threw me out at 16. Silence. Complete this time." Tyler's face changed first. Then my mother's. Then my father's, who closed his eyes for 1 second too long. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I slept in shelters. I said, I slept in temporary placements. I slept outside this building when I had nowhere else to go. So if we're talking about drama, let's at least call it by its real name. No one moved. The housing liaison looked stunned. Emma started crying. My mother covered her mouth. Tyler tried a smile that collapsed before it formed. "That's not how it happened." I met his eyes. "Then say how it happened." He couldn't. That was the thing. People who have survived on revision their whole lives usually freeze in the presence of detail. I had detail. He had a bid. My father spoke then. "And I will remember this for the rest of my life," he said. "That is how it happened? Not loud, not performative, but clear." My mother made a small broken sound. Tyler stared at him like he had been slapped. And just like that, the mythology lost structural support in public. No screaming. No cinematic collapse. Just truth. Finally standing somewhere with witnesses. Tyler left first. Shoved through the front doors and out onto the sidewalk where I had once slept. My mother sat down in one of the lobby chairs and cried into both hands. Emma stayed beside her. My father stood completely still for so long. I wondered whether he understood that the whole room was now oriented around what he did next. He looked at me and said, "I'm sorry. Not enough for all of it. Not enough for 16. Not enough for the winter. The shelters. The silence. The years, but real. And in front of people, that mattered." After the event, once the guests had thinned, and the staff had started stacking cups and folding signage, my mother asked if we could talk privately. We stepped into the small management office off the lobby. The same building. The same block. A different room. That also mattered. She sat down slowly. Eyes red. Mascara gone at the edges. "I told myself you'd be okay," she whispered. I leaned against the desk. "I know. That's the worst part," she said. "I knew you were stronger than Tyler. I used that against you." There it was. Not excuses. Not confusion. Recognition. I let the silence hold for a moment. Then said, "Children aren't backup adults." She cried harder. I did not comfort her immediately. That was another thing I had learned. You are not required to rescue people from the truth of what they did to you. Eventually, I handed her a tissue. We talked for almost an hour. About fear. About Tyler. About how she had spent years aligning herself with the loudest crisis in the room and calling that motherhood. About how easy it had been to mistake my competence for invulnerability. About Emma. About the text she sent me that first Christmas after I left, and how she had known, even as she typed it, that it was cruel. When she said that, I believed her. Not because belief erased anything, because accuracy matters. My father came in later. He looked as if something internal had finally given way. No speeches, no self-defense, just a tired man saying, "We failed you." Yes, they had. The word settled in the room like something heavy finally set down. What happened after that was not reconciliation in the sentimental sense. I do not believe in sudden clean healing for damage that took years to structure itself. What happened was slower, better, boundaried. My parents did not become different people overnight. Tyler certainly didn't. But the hierarchy changed because I changed. And because truth, once spoken clearly enough in public, becomes much harder for a family to stuff back into a drawer. I helped Emma secure better housing near campus the following semester. Not because I wanted to become the family savior, because I loved her. There is a difference. My mother and I began meeting for coffee sometimes. Short at first, then longer. She listened more than she used to. Sometimes she still drifted toward old habits, editing discomfort into softer language. When she did, I corrected her, calmly. She learned not to call that disrespect. My father started asking me questions about buildings, about financing, about why certain properties fail. I answered because, against all odds, I found that I wanted to be known by him now, that he finally understood knowing me would require humility. Tyler stayed away for a long time, months, then nearly a year. When he finally reached out, it was a message, not a call. 3 lines. I was wrong. I don't expect anything. I just know I was wrong. I stared at it a long time, then wrote back the only honest thing I had. I hope you become someone who understands what that cost. We have not become close. Maybe we never will. Some relationships do not end in reunion. They end in clarity. That is not failure. That is maturity. A year after buying Mercer Heights, I refinanced into better terms after stabilizing collections, improving retention, and proving the operational model. We acquired a second property, then a third. Smaller at first, then larger. Nothing reckless, nothing flashy. Disciplined growth. The kind nobody toasts early, because it does not make for good family gossip, which is fine. Quiet things hold. That has been the lesson of my entire life. The loud people in my family once mistook themselves for the future, because noise often looks like momentum from a distance. But noise burns money. Noise burns trust. Noise burns through every bridge it assumes will still be there afterward. Quiet is different. Quiet notices leaks before ceilings cave in. Quiet pays the bill before the penalty notice arrives. Quiet remembers forms, names, deadlines, maintenance schedules, reserve ratios, and which child in a family is coping too well to get the care she actually needs. Quiet survives. Then it scales. The last time I stood outside Mercer Heights at night, it was winter again. Not the same winter. Not the same girl. The entry lights glowed warm over clean brick. The security camera indicator blinked softly above the vestibule. A laminated card inside the glass listed emergency contacts, warming centers, and outreach resources updated for the season. People still passed in the cold. Some still had nowhere stable to go. I know better than to turn one building into a fantasy about solving suffering. But I also know this. The girl who once slept here needed one safe hour. One person who didn't treat her pain like an administrative inconvenience. One adult who didn't translate abandonment into a lesson she was supposed to thank them for. I cannot go back and give her that directly. So I build systems that give some version of it to someone else. That is the closest thing I know to redemption. When people hear the headline version of my story, they focus on the reversal. Homeless at 16. Owned the building by 25. It sounds cinematic when compressed like that. Clean. Satisfying. A neat arc with irony at the end. Real life was never that neat. It was forms. Shifts. Temporary beds. Holding back tears on public buses. Learning to eat slowly when you don't know when the next meal will be. Studying under fluorescent lights. Trusting the right adults 1 inch at a time. Saving money when every emergency wanted to spend it first. Saying no when guilt tried on your mother's voice. Learning that competence is not the same as worth. But it can buy you enough safety to discover your worth somewhere quieter. It was also this, realizing that the people who abandon you do not get the final vote on what your life means. That belongs to you. And maybe that is the part I most want someone listening to hear. Not everyone gets vindication in public. Not everyone gets a building. Titel. Or a room full of witnesses when the truth finally walks in uninvited. But you do not need a dramatic ending to prove that what happened to you was real. You do not need the people who failed you to become wise enough to deserve your forgiveness before you begin living well. You do not have to stay broken in the shape they left you. That is the lie people tell vulnerable girls. That once a family marks you as difficult, dramatic, ungrateful, or too much, you spend the rest of your life orbiting that label. You don't. Not if you learn how systems work. Not if you build anyway. Not if you stop mistaking survival for shame. My parents abandoned me when I was 16. That is true. Another truth is this. They were not powerful enough to define the rest. I did that. Slowly. Badly at first. Alone more often than I should have had to. But I did it. And now, when I unlock the front door of Mercer Heights, I do not see the girl on the sidewalk the way I used to. I still remember her. I always will. But I no longer see her as the beginning of the worst thing that ever happened to me. I see her as the beginning of the first person who ever really saved my life. Me.